Meshech Chochma for Parshas Bahaaloscha will begin with Perek Tes. And the Torah says, "Vayidaber Hashem el Moshe b'midbar Sinai b'shana hashenis l'tzeiso me'eretz Mitzrayim b'chodesh harishon lemor v'yasu b'nei Yisrael es haposach b'moado v'arba asor yom b'chodesh hazeh ben arbaim tasu oso b'moado." And imagine what's going on here, says Rabbi Simcha, with regard to that Pesach on the 14th of Nisan. How many Kohanim were there to serve and bring the Korban Pesach? And how many Jews were obligated in the Korban Pesach? Well, let's make the calculation, says Rabbi Simcha. Hine Hayu Sheshmeos Elef. There were 600,000 Jews, mi ben Chaf Gvarim, meaning of the males above the age of 20. Ulaman Diyomer Noshim Barishon Chova. The Gemara has one opinion that even though we can vacillate about the status of women in Korban Pesach in general, but on the first Korban Pesach, the women were included. And therefore, if there were 600,000 men, we can certainly assume that there was an equal number of women, and now you're up to 1.2 million people. The Kohanim, how many Kohanim were there to serve such a massive amount of people and bring their korbanos on that 14th day of Nisan? Lo hayrak Aaron ushnei banav. Unfortunately, Aaron had lost two of his children, Nadav Avihu. He's left with just Elazar and Itamar. He's got two sons. That's three Kohanim. You might argue, well, what about Pinchas? Well, Pinchas would be granted the status of a Kohen, but not now, much later on. Pinchas lo niskayin adayin. What about Moshe Rabbeinu? Could Moshe Rabbeinu serve as a Kohen? He says, V'chein Moshe. Moshe's status as a Kohen is way down the line. Imkain, Shlosha Kohanim. There are three Kohanim all told. Hayitzrichim lasok bavodas rivavos psachim bizman katzar. There's only the afternoon of the 14th, and there are tens of thousands of Korban Pesach, because generally speaking, the halacha is that a minui of a chabura on a Korban Pesach requires that the Korban Pesach will be eaten by the number of people in the minui, so that they wouldn't be leaving over any. So therefore, the groups of chaburis were relatively small numbers. If you had massive numbers on one single Korban Pesach, you wouldn't be able to guarantee that each person would be able to get a kezayis of the lamb. So we're talking about small groups. We're dividing up 1.2 million people into small groups. Therefore, there are rivavos Korbanos Pesach. There are tens of thousands of Korbanos Pesach, all being serviced by three Kohanim, Aaron and his two surviving sons. And we find a similar miracle, but perhaps not as amazing. Matzinu li Aaron shehenif chaf bet elef leviim biyom echad. During the process of Kiddush HaLeviim, which we read about last week's parsha, there were 22,000 Leviim that were sanctified through Tenufa on one day. Tenufa means you lift up the Kohen. So this is Aaron who's lifting up 22,000 Leviim on one day. And he tells you to look in the Medrash Echa Rabbah, Omarav Kahana, Chaf Bet Elef, Leviim Henif Aaron Biyom Echad. Aaron implemented a tenufa of 22,000 Leviim on one day. Shenemar Vayanefa Aarono Sam Tenufa Lifnei Hashem. And this is really an amazing achievement of Aaron. But perhaps even more great of an astonishing achievement was bringing the Karbanos Psachim of 1.2 million people. I don't know how many Karbanos that was. A massive amount of Karbanos, because again, the groups had to be relatively small. We had to guarantee a Kizayas of Achilas Lamb for each one of the members of the Chabura. Bechozos Havi Pella Yoser Gadol. And if we compare the Pella, the supernatural, amazing event of the Levium, to this one, it pales compared to this one. Lachein Diak Hashem Yisbarach. And we're going to look at Pasuk Gimel here at the beginning of Perek Tes. It says, Bein Arbaim Tasu Oso. And the Torah went out of its way to emphasize that the entire bookends, the period of time, that interval of time that was appropriate for the Korban Pesach was just Bein Harbayim, a little bit after noon until sunset. Why did the Torah have to go out of its way here and emphasize this? If you open up to Parshas Bo, where the Torah has an entire section about the Korban Pesach, the Torah already indicates in Parshas Bo that it was Bein Harbayim. Why the repetition here? Says Rameir Simcha, the Torah is emphasizing that the Zman is Katzar, there's a very limited amount of time with an amazing, massive amount of Karbanos that have to be brought. Shebizman Katzar mechatzos hayom ha'erev. Vehichpil ha'kosuv. If you fast forward to Pasuk Hey, again the Torah emphasizes Bein Harbayim. And it says, Vayasu es ha'posach, Barisha barbasar yom l'chodesh Bein Harbayim. Ki hu Pella Gadol. This was a supernatural event, extraordinary. Now, Rameir Simcha, from this point and on, is going to dedicate the rest of the paragraph to make a point about how HaKadosh Baruch Hu, through his hashgacha, made it a little bit easier for the Kohanim to achieve this goal. Now let's make the following calculation. If the 14th of Nisan, Erev Yontif, Erev Pesach, is Shabbos, then the Karbanos of Shabbos, let's say, for example, the Tom Shel Shachar, Tom Shel Ben Arbayim, which are brought on Shabbos, and then there's a process which is called Hekter Chalavim Ve'varim, or call it Hekter Ha'imurim. And again, in the case of a Karban Olah, the entire Karban is burnt on the Mizbeach. And this could occupy the Kohanim on the 14th of Nisan, if it's Shabbos, Bein Arbayim. So what's the advantage, so to speak, of the 14th of Nisan coinciding with Shabbos? There's no need to get involved in the Hekter Hevarim. You can postpone that until the nighttime, even though at night it'll be Yontif. But what's the din of Evarim Updarim Shenis Nisosru were left over from Shabbos into Yontif? He says, Tziva, I think, means it was divine providence that on this particular year, Rosh Chodesh Nisan Hoya Bi Echad B'Shabbos. Chazal say that the day of Hakamas HaMishkan, which was Rosh Chodesh Nisan, was a Sunday, Echad B'Shabbos. That has to do with the fact that Sunday, I mean, we shouldn't use the English word, but Yom Rishon of a Shavua has a special significance. So it's not coincidental that the day of Hakamas HaMishkan was on Yom Rishon. Now, if you fast forward 14 days or if you want to calculate 13 days, because let's say that Sunday is already day number 1 of Nisan, so you add another 13 days. So you have 7 days till the following Sunday, and then 6 days till the following Friday. And then it turns out that the 14th of Nisan is on a Friday. No, I'm sorry. Let me get this again. If you're going to add 13 days to Sunday, then what you're going to end up is on Shabbos, right? Because 14 days from Sunday would be Sunday. But 13 days after Sunday, which means the 14th of Nisan, would now fall on a Shabbos. So that Korban Pesach was being brought on Shabbos. Because how would this alleviate the burden of Aaron Ubanov? Lo hutzuchu Aaron Ubanov lahaktir emurim ad ha'erev. They can delay the process of Haktorah of the emurim of the Karmanola until the evening. Why? Because of a principle which is formulated by the Gemara in Shabbos Kuf Yud Daled, that Chelvei Shabbos craving beyond it. You could be makriv and maktir, the chalavim of the karbanos of Shabbos, in this case, the Shnei Atmidim, beyond it. So therefore, they were alleviated from the extra burden of Haktoras Emurim. Aval b'kviyas acheres hoyelahem haktir bein arbayin. The chelvei chol ain't craving beyond it. So let's say, for example, Pesach would fall on a Wednesday. I'm just throwing out a day, which would mean that Erev Pesach was on a Tuesday. Now, on Tuesday, Erev Pesach, the Kohanim are dedicated not only to the process of bringing the Korbanos Pesach, Sachim, but they also have to worry about Monday's Hakrava of the Emurim. Why? Because any Emurim that were not burnt on the Mizbeach on Monday had to be burnt on Tuesday, and you couldn't delay it al Rosh HaMizbeach until Wednesday, because we have a principle that on Yontif itself, you're not allowed to be maktir karbanos of chol, meaning, in this case, haktoras emurim of chol. Aval b'kviyas acheres, therefore, if Erev Pesach would have fallen on any other day of the week, hoyolem lahaktir bein arbayim, they would have to be preoccupied with the extra burden on that afternoon of Erev Pesach of being maktir the varim of yesterday's korban. The chelvei chol ain't craving beyond it. They could not delay it until the following night. Izeh efshar klal. And that has to do with the laws of Nosar and so forth and so on. But the bottom line is that Ashkoch would have it that Erev Pesach was on Shabbos, and therefore they could delay the Karbanos of Shabbos until Motzei Shabbos, meaning Yontif, because we have a principle that Chelvei Shabbos craving beyond. Now again, I don't know personally in the overall picture of it how much that kicks in and contributes to lightening the burden of the Kohanim. We're still left with the amazing feat of 3 Kohanim being makriv karbanos for 1.2 million Jews. B'nei Beseira in Pesach Docha Shabbos, Hainu al Haktorah Nistapku. Why is it that B'nei Beseira were vacillating back and forth about whether the Korban Pesach would override the Shabbos? I mean, after all, that Pesach was on Shabbos. I mean, Erev Pesach was on Shabbos. Pesach was on Yom Rishon. And therefore, it seems crystal clear, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that Pesach overrides the Shabbos, because on that day itself, which was Shabbos, it was the 14th of Nisan, Erev Pesach Shabbos, and they brought the Korban Pesach. But the answer is no. What Bnei Beseira were vacillating about was not the shechita and the zrikas hadam, etc., of the Korban Pesach. That certainly clearly would override the Shabbos. That's what happened in that time. But the question would be, what about Haktorah? And since it was Erev Pesach, when were they makter they murid? The possibility would be, and we don't know, that they would delay the Haktorah Sei Murim until after Shabbos. And certainly with regard to the Haktorah Sei Murim of the Korbanos of Shabbos, that's exactly what they did, because they wanted to be free of any extra burden, and there's no problem of Korbanos of Shabbos to be makriv them on Yontif. But what did they do with the Pesach itself? Perhaps the Haktorah, the Pesach, they did not necessarily achieve on Erev Pesach, which was Shabbos, but rather they delayed it until Motzi Shabbos, which of course they could have done. Okay, now I'd like to fast forward, if you will, to Pasuk Zayin. So let's take a look in Perek Tes, Pasuk Zayin. Now the Torah describes a group of people, anonymous, that were Tmeim L'Nefesh, and they did not bring the Pesach on the 14th of Nisan. Vayomru Hanoshim Hahema, and this group of people came forward to Moshe Rabbeinu, and they said, they said to Moshe, Anachnu Tmeim L'Nefesh Adam Lama Nigara Lebilti Lahakriv Es Korban Hashem B'Moado B'Soch B'nei Yisrael. So there are a number of questions to be raised here. And Rabbi Simcha is going to first and foremost focus on these last three words in the pasuk, B'Soch B'nei Yisrael. What are they coming to emphasize? They seem redundant. And as a general question, what were the people saying? What do you mean Lamani Gara? They were, after all, Tmeim L'Meis, and a Tamei Mes cannot bring any carbon, let alone a carbon Pesach. Also, the fact that the Torah sort of obfuscates the identity of these individuals. Vayomru Hanoshim, that itself is a curiosity. Who were these people? Rabbi Simcha begins his discussion with the Gemara that we mentioned earlier, Psachim Samach Vav, about the Bnei Beseira. And just to quote the Gemara, Halacha Zunis Alma B'Bnei Beseira, the Bnei Beseira could not remember this halacha, whether or not Pesach is Doche Es HaShabbos. Hine, Amru Bnei Beseira Lo Yadu Im Pesach Doche HaShabbos, Umakshim. And there's a general question that all the commentaries raise. The Yom Rishon Shel Nisiyim, the first day of the Nisiyim, right? The Torah tells us back in Bamidbar Zion, Vayehi Amakriv B'Yom HaRishon is Karbano, and that B'Yom HaRishon, the Sifri identifies as Yom Rishon L'chol Yemos HaShavua. And that's a covet that the first of the Nisiyim to bring the carbon brought it on a Sunday. Yom Rishon Shel HaShavua. So now, again, let's go through the calculation once again. If the first day of the Nisiyim was Rishon L'Maisa Brachos, was on a Sunday, then the 14th day of Nisan, 13 days after Sunday, would be on a Shabbos. V'dacha Pesach HaShabbos. And yet they brought the Korban Pesach on that very day, the 14th of Nisan, even though it was Shabbos. So how could it be that the Bnei Beseira, hundreds of years later, had forgotten who has to remember? I mean, that's exactly what happened in the Midbar on this very day of Erev Pesach, which was a Shabbos. They brought the carbon. What kind of a suffix did they have? Vanira. So Meir Simcha now wants to come up with an original interpretation of the suffix of the Bnei Beseira. And by the way, just as an introduction, this chiddush that we're about to see is not the main chiddush, the revolution here of Rabbi Simcha. I'm just telling you that, we have to be impressed by the first chiddush, but there's going to be an even more impressive chiddush in this very same presentation. The Yerushalmi, Sof Perek Shlosha, the Nidarim, Amru, Mitzvahs Shabbos Molech. This is a pasuk in Nehemiah, the 9th chapter, and the word mitzvos, with regard to Shabbos, is written with 2 vavs. That's called molech. Lo diachashi shkula keneged kol mitzvoseh shel Torah. That Shabbos, on one side of the scale, would weigh in against the other 612 mitzvahs. Now, Rabbi Simcha says, let's add to this principle what the Yerushalmi investigates, which is greater, the mitzvah of Shabbos, which again is shkula keneged kol mitzvahs, or the mitzvah of Milah. And the Yerushalmi says that Milah is also shkula keneged kol mitzvahs. So if that be the case, then Shabbos and Milah are on the same level. They're equal. So the Yerushalmi wants to know, is there any way of tipping the scale and determining which is greater, Shabbos or Milah? And the Yerushalmi says that Milah is greater than Shabbos. And Milah will supersede the Shabbos, Milah docha Shabbos. So that means that if the 8th day of the baby's, since they is on Shabbos, they will violate the Shabbos for the mitzvah of Milah. Okay, now what we have is the following. We've got 2 mitzvahs, Milah and Shabbos, that are both shkulim keneged kol mitzvahs. And now we need a pasav ashlishi to be machriya, which is greater, Milah or Shabbos. And the answer is, what happens if there's a collision between Milah and Shabbos? And the halach is that Milah overrides Shabbos. We see now that Milah is even greater than Shabbos. And Yerushalmi offers a mashal as to, to sort of embellish and demonstrate pedagogically how we have proven that Milah is greater than Shabbos. Mashal. Lishtei matronios, shayubos zu al gav zu. Imagine 2 noble women are walking up the same avenue, and the question is, there's only room for one carriage to go by. Which one of the 2 is going to make way for the other one? Zushi yoredes b'nei chaverta, if let's call it, okay, we'll use Jewish names, even though they don't have to be Jewish matronios, but let's say if Leah moves onto the side of the road in order to make way for Rachel, then we know ata yodea shechaverta gdolei mena. The reason why Leah has to make way for Rachel is because Rachel is greater than Leah. Imkain, when there's a head-on collision between Milah and Shabbos, who's going to make way and waive his or her rights, for the other one? Is Milah chamura mishabbos, mimena, mishabbos. How do I know that Milah is greater than Shabbos? Because Shabbos will make way for Milah. Okay. Now, where do we fit Korban Pesach into this picture. Is Korban Pesach greater than Milah? Is it inferior to Milah? Is it greater than Shabbos? Is it equal to Shabbos? Inferior to Shabbos? Where do we place Korban Pesach on this hierarchy? Nimtza, the Pesach b'tzibur, because Pesach is brought by the entire tzibur, and yet he nitches mipnei Milah. If the members of the community are arelim, which is what happened at the time of the first Korban Pesach, because Pesach Mitzrayim, the Jews, with the exception of Shevet Levi, as we'll see, did not circumcise themselves. And the halacha is nidches v'nei Milah. We're going to have to push off the Korban Pesach because they did not fulfill the mitzvah Milah. That's how great the mitzvah Milah is. It's not only greater than Shabbos, because it's Docha Shabbos, it's greater than Pesach, it's Docha Pesach. The Ikulo Tzubra Areim Amrina Lahu Gmar Psachim Zilu Kumu Mu'ala. Until you implement Milah, forget it. You're not online for the Korban Pesach. Okay, fine. So now we have Milah that's Docha both Shabbos and Korban Pesach. How do we compare Shabbos to Korban Pesach? So we have two things that are pushed off and negated by Milah, and that's Shabbos and Pesach. Now we understand the suffix of Bnei B'Seira. Lachein, kishachala of Pesach lios b'Shabbos, lo yadu Bnei B'Seira miu gadol on Pesach on Shabbos. We have now the 14th of Nisan on Shabbos. We have a head-on collision between between Pesach and Shabbos, which is greater. Ezo matrono yoredis mipnei chaverta, which is the Leah that's going to make room to allow Rachel to go first. Does Shabbos step aside? Or on the contrary, Shabbos will push off Pesach. Oh, so now we can, this is the first Chiddush of Rabbi Simcha. Now we can understand why the Bnei B'Seira could not come to any conclusion based on the original Korban Pesach. Lachein lo motzi lemifshet mimidbar. Sheshamayu rubam arelim. He tells you to look in Tos Kedushin Lamed Zayin. Most of the people of the Israelites were uncircumcised because they had just get out of Mitzrayim. Vafilu hachi. Now we know that Milah is Docha Pesach, and yet they brought the Pesach on the 14th, despite the fact that most of the tzibur were arelim. How could that be? Says Rabbi Simcha, Hora Shahaisa, Shetitcha Pesach Es HaMilah. So therefore, Ben B'Seira were divine. They couldn't derive any conclusions based on that original Korban Pesach, on that 14th of Nisan, which was Shabbos, because that Pesach was Docha Milah, and Milah is even greater than Shabbos. So if Pesach is Docha Milah, then how much more so would it be Docha Shabbos? But normally Pesach would not be Docha Milah. It's only in this case because of the Rosh Hashanah. Rosh Hashanah shetitche Pesach Milah v'yasu Pesach shema reilin. Im kain im he doches Milah. Right now, most of the tzibur are reilin, and yet we're going to override Milah for the sake of the Korban Pesach. That's a great Rosh Hashanah. V'hi gedolim in a Shabbos, and Milah, which is now being overridden, is greater than Shabbos. Is Kolshken how much more so she dochas a Shabbos? Then certainly they would bring the Korban Pesach on that Shabbos, but not because, as a general universal rule, Pesach overrides the Shabbos. In this particular circumstance, by virtue of the Rosh Hashanah, Pesach would override the Shabbos. And the logic is that if Pesach in this particular circumstance overrides Milah, and Milah is greater than Shabbos, then certainly with a Kal V'chomer, Pesach that overrides Milah certainly will override the Shabbos, but that's all Rosh Hashanah. Brilliant. I mean, again, this is this Rabbeinu Simcha at his best, best form. So again, Bahaaloscha, if it wasn't for Bahaaloscha, Mila, in the case of Arelim, would have pushed off the Korban Pesach. So now we don't know what happens. That's Ben B'Seir Safek in Pesach on Shabbos, because which is greater, Pesach or Shabbos? Okay. I'd kind of kofal. Now we get to the main revolution of Rameh Simcha.
Rab Berzon?
Yes.
Me. This was the 1 year after Yetziat Mitzrayim, right?
Correct.
So most people were circumcised. Didn't they circumcise in Egypt before Korban Pesach, or not yet?
Not yet. Not yet. There was some who did, but most not yet. And that's why the Yerushalmi says that Korban Pesach was a Rosh Shah. It could be brought by Arelim.
Well, that means there were two such, because in Mitzrayim also the same thing.
It could be. Could be right. I don't know. I didn't see the Yerushalmi inside.
Thank you.
Okay, now we move on. Halavim, Hayunimolim, B'Mitzrayim. When they got to the Midbar, the Levium themselves were already circumcised. So the entire Kal V'chomer, which we use to derive the conclusion that Pesach would override the Shabbos when Erev Pesach is on a Shabbos, doesn't apply to the Levium. It could apply to the rest, the balance of Klal Yisrael, because they were Arelim, and therefore their bringing of the Korban Pesach was a Rosh Shah. But what about the Levium? There's no din of Rosh Shah with regard to Levium. They were already Nimolim. So would the Pesach, with the obligation of Korban Pesach on the Levium, override the Shabbos? The reason why the Pesach of the balance of Klal Yisrael overrides the Shabbos is because of this Kal V'chomer, because they were Arelim, and yet there was a Rosh Shah to override the din of Milah for the sake of the Korban Pesach, and therefore Kolshkein, we would override the Shabbos because Milah is greater than Shabbos. But in the case of the Levium, they were Nimolim. We don't have no Rosh Shah that would override Milah, and how can you therefore make the next step that we would override the Shabbos? If we isolate the Levium, there was no Rosh Shah. We can no longer operate with super extra halachic, extra legal rules. We have to remain within the framework of the rules themselves. And now we don't know exactly what would be if the entire Klal Yisrael had been circumcised. Should we say Hoya Pesach Korev, the Pesach would be brought on Shabbos without a Rosh Shah? The Im Shah Pesach Shalahem Ein Adocha Milah, in the case of the Levium, their Korban Pesach does not have within it that power to override Milah because they were Molim. Amor, we should now entertain the logical conclusion, below Dochi Shabbos. Kimo, She Pesach Nidcha B'fnei Milah. Right now, Pesach is postponed because of Milah, in the case of Arelim, which means that Pesach is lower than Milah. We don't know whether Pesach is above or below Shabbos. And therefore, Yitochen She Pesach Nidcha B'nei Shabbos HaChamura. It's very possible, and that's why B'nai B'Tzeira vacillated about this point, that Shabbos is more severe, more chomer than Pesach. And therefore, the Levium are in a bind. on this particular Pesach? And they bring the Korban Pesach and override the Shabbos. And there's a very strong, compelling logic that Shabbos is more chamura than Pesach, and therefore they would have to remove themselves from the Korban Pesach. Klal Yisrael, the balance of it, they could override the Shabbos because they're overriding Milah. But the Levium are not overriding Milah, and if Shabbos is more chamur than Pesach, there's no Rosh Hashanah. What's going to allow them to bring the Korban Pesach? He says it's not logical to assume that all of Klal Yisrael would bring the Korban Pesach and not the Levium. Sheka'es Kol Yisrael Pesach Shalem Docha Milah V'lachein Docha Shabbos, and what, the Levium would not be Docha Shabbos? Their Korban Pesach cannot be brought on Shabbos because they circumcise themselves. Therefore, paradoxically, you're going to tell me that they're excluded from the Korban Pesach? Yeah, mitzvahs Pesach Shalem Chalusho Kana should be relatively low ebb in comparison to the rest of Klal Yisrael who are not Nimolim. Could you imagine this, Rabbosai? The logical halachic reasoning in an abstract world, says Rabbi Simcha, leads us to an untenable, unacceptable conclusion that all of Klal Yisrael were what? Were Arelim, and therefore the only way they could bring the Korban Pesach is by activating a Rosh Hashanah. And once we activate the Rosh Hashanah to override Milah, and with the Kolch game we override the Shabbos. But the Levim, because they were Nimolim, therefore their halach is not that of a Rosh Hashanah. They cannot say that they override Milah, and therefore they can't bring the Korban Pesach on Shabbos. Hayitachin neged muskal. Now we can shed a brand new light on a pasuk here in front of us. Who came forward to say Lama Nigara? Why are you cutting us out of this Pesach? Members of which Shevet? Does the Torah tell us? No. That's Torah Shebal Peh. We're going to identify the Shevet of this group of people who came forward with the claim of Lama Nigara based on two comments in Torah Shebal Peh. Zeu shebo b'taina. It was Levium that came forward with the claim, Lama Nigara lebilti hikra v'skarban Hashem b'tok b'nei Yisrael. Okay, how do we know it was Levium? So let me just fast forward for a second. B'nei Levi nimoled by Mishal vel Tzafon, according to one opinion in Chazal and Torah Shebal Peh, who are these Anoshim? They were Mishal vel Tzafon. Shayutmeim linadav aviv. They were the ones who carried out the bodies of Nadav Avihu on the very day of the dedication of the Mikdash, of the Mishkan, when Nadav Avihu perished. Mishal and Al Tzafon were Leviim. Oh, there's another opinion in Chazal. Who are these Tmeim here in our parsha? Nosei Aronot Shel Yosef, Shel Hayu Leviim. These were those who carried the beer of Yosef that was taken up from Mitzrayim. They had contracted Tumas Mes, and they were Leviim. So no matter who these Anoshim were, they were certainly Leviim. Now let me go back and read the two lines that I skipped. Halo Kevon Pesach Shalahem, the Pesach of Klal Yisrael, of the balance of Klal Yisrael. Doche Milah, because they were Arelin, and therefore Doche Shabbos. Gam Pesach Shalonu, representing Shevet Levi, these Anoshim, this group came forward and said, Gam Pesach Shalonu Ayom. We should also be able to join together with the rest of Klal Yisrael and bring the Pesach today on Yudalid B'Nisan and Erev Pesach Shechalios B'Shabbos, even though the heter for Bnei Yisrael, the balance of Israel, was Al Pio Rosh Shah, last Asperis, Gam Lanu Bnei Levi Hanimolim Yidoche Shabbos. How much more so if you're being Doche Shabbos for the sake of Mulim, of Arelim, how much more so we who fulfilled the mitzvah, we were dedicated and loyal to the mitzvah of Milah, and we are Nimulim, how much more so we should be Doche Shabbos. Now Rabbi Simcha says, I now understand 3 words in this pasuk. B'toch B'nei Yisrael. If B'nei Yisrael are bringing the Karban, Pesach on Yudalit, and they're overriding the Shabbos, then how much more so we who are Nimolim should be able to be Doche Shabbos. It's unbelievable. Unbelievable. This, I've told you many times that it amazes me what a Machadesh Rabbi Simcha is, but this tops them all. He's shedding a whole new light on the parsha. Man, how many thousands of years is it since this Torah was given to us? And Rabbi Simcha has a new shot in this. These Levium were not only coming to complain, well, with Meim, why do you exclude us? And Moshe Rabbeinu is going to bring down the parsha of Pesach Sheni. There's something much more far-reaching going on over here. They are coming to represent all of Shevet Levi. These were the Anoshim Chashuvim. These were the avant-garde or the front-line representatives of all of Shevet Levi. And they were coming in front of Moshe Rabbeinu and saying, this is an impossible situation. You're telling me that because there's a Rosh Hashanah for Bnei Yisrael that overrides Milah, therefore we can override the Shabbos, but for us Levim, we don't have the Rosh Hashanah. We do not override Milah, and therefore we're not going to bring out Pesach on Shabbos? Why? Lamani Gara. Why are you cutting us out? Because we're Mulim? Can't be. And Moshe Rabbeinu accepted their argument, and all of Bnei Yisrael, the entire people, those who were Tahor and not the Tmeim, would bring the Pesach on Shabbos, on Yud Daled. It's just mind-boggling, mind-boggling. All right. Let's fast forward now to the beginning of Perek Yud Beis, and the end of Parshas Bahaaloscha, a bit of a painful parsha to read. Let's see it inside. V'tedaber Miriam v'Aaron b'Moshe al odos ha'isha kushis asher lakach ki isha kushis lakach. What's the nature of their lashon hara? The Torah doesn't spell it out. It mentions that this was the wife of Moshe, but if you take a look at the next pasuk and you do a little bit of Sherlock Holmes, you can figure it out, because it says Vayomer al kach ach b'Moshe diber Hashem alo gam banu diber. We also have nevuah, and Rashi explains that they knew that Moshe was poresh mi ishto, and they came to the conclusion that mi samcha, why are you greater than us? We're living a married life, a marital life, normal married life. Why aren't you? So Rashi asks the obvious question: how did Miriam and Aaron know what was going on inside the tent of Moshe Rabbeinu? They weren't peeping toms. How did they know that Moshe Rabbeinu separated himself from his wife? And Rashi and Chazal tell a story about two uh, two prophets who are prophesying, and give me a second, I'll see if I can find it for you. Eldad u'Medad hayu misnabim b'machne, and when Tzipora, the wife of Moshe, heard about this, she said, woe to these women who are married to prophets, because my husband separated himself from me, and now they will separate themselves from their wives. Woe to these wives of Eldad u'Medad. Now, the advantage of this approach, Rabbi Simcha is going to give a whole nother approach, is that just one second, is that in the previous parsha of Eldad u'Medad, the Torah opens up, this is in, if you want to take a look inside, is in Perek Yud Aleph, Pasuk Tes Zayin, with the story of Sanhedrin. And it says, Esfo li shivim ish miziknei Yisrael, etc., etc. I mean, now, there's a bit of a smichos haparshios here. We had the misonanim, and then we had the parsha of shivim ish miziknei Yisrael. Amongst the shivim ish, the Gemara tells us, the 70 people that made up the Sanhedrin were Eldad u'Medad. They gave up their places because there were two other members, or I should say two other qualified candidates for Sanhedrin that were bumped off because the number had to round it off at 70. And Eldad u'Medad, as an act of kindness, removed themselves from Sanhedrin in order to make room for another two Leviim, for another two Zkanim, to sit on the Sanhedrin. So that the parsha that immediately precedes the Lashon Hara of Miriam, which is the parsha of Sanhedrin that now leads into the parsha of Eldad u'Medad, it's all one, because it's only through Eldad u'Medad, more precisely through the wives of Eldad u'Medad, and the Kavat of Tzipora, that Miriam was able to know that Moshe was Poresh Mi'isht. So that's the classic approach to the question, how did Miriam and Aaron know that Moshe was no longer conducting regular, normal marital life? Comes along Rabbi Simcha with his own answer to this question, an original answer to how Miriam and Aaron figured out that Moshe was separated from his wife. And he quotes the Gemara in Sanhedrin, and the Gemara in Sanhedrin starts with the whole Masechta, with a Mishnah that records Machlokes Rabbi Yehuda and Chachamim. How many members make up Sanhedrin? Is it 71 or is it 70? Rabbi Yehuda says it's 70 because Esfali Shivim, etc. And the Chachamim say that the 70 is minus Moshe. When we add Moshe, it's 71. Rabbi Yehuda derives it from Psukim, and he has to reinterpret Psukim, take it out of Pshuto Shel Mikra, because the pasuk, for example, says, Hisyatzvu sham imcha. The Chachamim of Rabbi Yehuda say imcha means that they will stand together with you, the 70 with you, Moshe. You'll be the Nasi of the Sanhedrin, and therefore it's 71. Rabbi Yehuda says imcha means shechina. Imcha yamdu michutz la'oel v'lo yavo li'oel. Certain dinim of the Sanhedrin with regard to Luchkas HaGozis and so forth, and it's with the Shechina. Then the Gemara quotes another pasuk. And then the pasuk says, itcha together with you. So it's 70 plus 1. And Rabbi Yehuda says, no. Itcha means domim lecha, that you can only appoint someone to the Sanhedrin if he's on that level of Moshe Rabbeinu in terms of his yediyah. Okay, fine. Now, let's fast forward to a Sifri, which the Rambam codifies Bahaaloscha at the beginning of Hilchos Sanhedrin. The Sifri says that we need a representation on the high court of 70 Zkenim, Kohanim and Leviim. Because the pasuk says in Parshas Shoftim, it says, "Ubasel haKohanim vel haLeviim vel haShofet." The you Kohanim and Leviim bo, that there should be the mitzvah is, it's not likuva, but the mitzvah is that the bezdin should have on it, sitting on the bench, Kohanim and Leviim, and the Rambam passes like that in Hilchos Sanhedrin. And then he quotes Tanakh. That's the way it was, that they put at least one Kohen minimum on the Sanhedrin. Director of Meir Simcha, Im Kain v'Sanhedrin shel Moshe, Mi Hoya Kohen. Who is the Kohen who sat on the Sanhedrin? If it was Aaron Ubanov, and if we go like the Chachamim against Rabbi Yehuda, that all told we need 71, Moshe plus the other 70. Well, included in the 70 are Aaron Ubanov, representing Shevet Kahuna. That's impossible. Because Aaron is a brother to Moshe. They can't sit on the same Sanhedrin, Krovim Psulim. And not only that, Aaron's sons, nephews of Moshe Rabbeinu, that's called Rishon B'Sheni, are also Posel of Sanhedrin. The only possibility, therefore, by proselytization is Pinchas. And Pinchas is what's called a Shlishi Berishon. Why? Because it's Pinchas ben Elazar ben Aaron. So Aaron is the brother of Moshe. Moshe is therefore the great uncle of Pinchas. Pinchas is the son of Elazar, the son of Aaron. And Rishon B'Shlishi is kosher. So now we can assume, and we have to assume, that it was Pinchas who was the representative of Shevet Kahuna on the bench. And he sat with Moshe on the high court of 71 elders. There's a problem. Why? The Tumim, that's from Yonasan Eibeshitz, Paskins, based on a Yerushalmi, that Moshe would be possibly edus if he were to testify against the wife of Pinchas, against all theoretical case. It never came up practically, but what's going on over here? Imo shel Pinchas, haisa mibnos Putiel Yisra, which means that Elazar, the son of Aaron, married the daughter of Yisra, which makes Elazar and Moshe Rabbeinu not only uncle and nephew, but also brothers-in-law. They were married to two sisters. So that means that Elazar HaKohen was married to Tzipora, Ashes Moshe's sister. Moshe and Elazar are married to two sisters. That makes them brothers-in-law. V'im came, Hoya lePinchas. What was the status of Pinchas vis-a-vis Moshe? Rishon b'Sheni b'chad Baal. Vayupsulim l'din mitzad kurva. Now, if Moshe is a brother-in-law to Elazar, besides being his uncle, right? He's a brother-in-law to Elazar. They both married two sisters. That makes Pinchas the nephew of Moshe, which means that he can't sit on the same court with Moshe, bechad Baal, based on the marriage relationship between Moshe and Tzipora, and that of Elazar with Achos Tzipora, that now disqualifies Pinchas from sitting on the Sanhedrin with Moshe. But Hashem says to Moshe at the time of Har Sinai, everyone else goes back to their tents after the Shloshis Me'agbola, but you, Moshe, stay with me. You don't go back to your tent, meaning you cannot resume marital relations with your wife. Is therefore, says Rabbi Simcha, an unbelievable chiddush. Havi ke'ilu nisgarsha. It's as if, because there's no intimacy between Moshe and Tzipora, it's as if Tzipora was divorced from Moshe Rabbeinu. Now, if Tzipora is divorced from Moshe Rabbeinu, then Pinchas could sit on the Bezdin. Because the only reason Pinchas was disqualified from the Sanhedrin was because of the marriage relationship between Moshe and Tzipora, making Moshe Pinchas's uncle by marriage. B'chad Baal. Now, just to skip to the punchline, because we're running out of time, he says the following, that Pinchas was appointed to sit on the Sanhedrin, because the mitzvah was that to be one member of Shevet Kahuna on the Sanhedrin. And Aaron and Miriam witnessed this. His bonanu, at the end of the paragraph, his bonanu is Aaron and Miriam, Eich Yosef Moshe Sanhedrin in Pinchas. It can't be. It's Rishon B'Sheni B'chad Baal. Maybe Moshe separated from his wife Tzipora. That's the only way we can explain that Pinchas is not a Karov to Moshe by virtue of the fact that his father is married to the sister of Tzipora. And therefore Pinchas could serve and he qualifies on the Sanhedrin. The Chakru V'Darshu. So they went out and they checked it out. Yosemite doesn't tell you how they did so. And they realized Shapirish Miishno. Ulakach, and therefore Vatidaber Miriam V'Aaron. So it means that if you ask the question, how did Miriam and Aaron come to this strange conclusion that Moshe was no longer conducting normal intimacy and married life with his wife Tzipora, how did they know such a thing? You don't have to introduce that they were there standing after Eldad and Medad were Nevi'im, and they heard the wives saying, and they heard Tzipora saying that never the wives of these two Nevi'im are going to have to suffer the same destiny as me. Forget about all that, says Rabbi Simcha. Aaron and Miriam were Lamdanim. They were Grace Lamdanim. They learned in Bahaaloscha Yeshiva, and they understood that Pinchas was possible within Kurva to sit on the Sanhedrin. How could Moshe appoint Pinchas onto the Sanhedrin? And it had to be Pinchas because there were no other Kohanim who would qualify for the Sanhedrin. There were only 4 Kohanim in the world at that time. If Moshe Rabbeinu appointed and approved the appointment of Pinchas to the Sanhedrin, it must be that he divorced his wife. Hence, they knew and they spoke Lashon. All right, we'll just summarize very quickly the highlights of what we covered today. We began with a discussion about the amazing miracle, supernatural, of 3 Kohanim bringing karbanos for 1.2 million Bnei Yisrael, and how that ties in with the fact that that Erev Pesach was on Shabbos. Number 2, we discussed a new interpretation of Lama Nigara, and these Leviim were representing all of Shevet Levi, and they were claiming, how could it be that all Bnei Yisrael, because they were Arelim, their Karban would be Doche Shabbos and our korban as Levium, because we're not included in the Rosh Show with the Kal V'chomer, would not override the Shabbos. How can that be? Lamani Gara, B'toch B'nei Yisrael. And finally, the answer to the question, the original answer of Simcha, how Aaron and Miriam knew that Moshe Rabbeinu was Poresh Mi'ishta. But take this opportunity, which everyone, a great Shabbos Parshas Bahaaloscha, and thank you all for joining me today.